When you think of visionary leaders and billion-dollar empires, who comes to mind? But what if I told you the most overlooked businessman of our generation might just be this guy?
I don't give a f***.
Dana White.
Dana White.
Dana White.
Dana White.
The reigning, defending UFC CEO and president of the world, Dana White.
Without him, none of the UFC would have ever taken place the way it did.
In the last 20 years, Dana White transformed a bankrupt company into one of the biggest sports promotions in the world. But success like this doesn't come without making a few enemies.
There's plenty of people that would like to assault me. Get in line.
Some of whom come from unexpected places.
He's not a good person. He seems to have lost his character somewhere along the way.
From mafia encounters, political disasters, and global controversies, Dana White's journey isn't just about success, it's about survival.
What Dana's done with the UFC is like one of the most legendary business stories.
Dana White was born on July 28, 1969 in Manchester, Connecticut, but spent most of his childhood in Boston, growing up in a difficult environment.
I came from a family with a single mom. My dad was an alcoholic, was never around, and when he did show up, you didn't want him around. You know what I mean? He was usually drunk. And then my mother, she worked a lot, wasn't around, so me and my sister were home a lot. Alone. One of the things I think about growing up alone is, there's a lot of stuff that you have to learn on your own.
In 5th grade, Dana's mother June moved the family to Las Vegas in search of better job opportunities. Dana attended St. Viator School and later enrolled at Bishop Gorman High School. During his freshman year, Dana met a classmate named Lorenzo Fertitta.
How did you know the Fertitta?
So Lorenzo and I went to school together in Las Vegas.
Oh, okay.
We were in the same class. It's not like me and Lorenzo were best friends growing up in high school. We knew each other.
Right.
He came from money, I did not.
By the time Dana and Lorenzo were in school, Lorenzo's father, Frank Fertitta Jr., had already established station casinos in 1976, beginning with the launch of Bingo Palace, which was later renamed Palace Station. The casino, designed to serve local residents rather than tourists, became a massive success, cementing the Fertittas' wealth and influence in Las Vegas. Years later, Frank Fertitta Jr. passed the business on to his sons, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta III, who expanded the company into a gaming empire.
The Fertittas are proven great businessmen. If you look at what they've done, and if you really know the history of the Fertittas and what they've built and what they've done, incredible businessmen.
This relationship would prove crucial years later when Lorenzo Fertitta partnered with Dana to build the empire that became the UFC. However, Dana's high school years were far from smooth. After being expelled, he moved to Maine to live with his grandparents and finish his education. Once he graduated high school, Dana returned to Boston, where he took a job as a bellman at the Boston Harbor Hotel.
I was a bellman in there. I was 19 years old. I made good money. And I was literally standing in the lobby one day, and I'm like, what am I doing here? This isn't me. This isn't what I want. And I walked out the front door, and one of my good friends, he's still one of my good friends today, who was the doorman, says, what are you doing? I said, I'm quitting. He's like, what? What are you going to do? I said, I want to be in the fight business. He said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
After leaving his job, Dana began teaching boxing classes. He started working at a small boxing gym in Boston, owned by former Golden Gloves champion Peter Welch, who generously allowed Dana to work there for free to gain first-hand experience in the fight business. However, Dana's growing involvement in the boxing world quickly caught the attention of the Winter Hill Gang, Boston's most notorious criminal organization, led by the infamous mob boss, James Whitey Bulger.
When he walked down the street, the sidewalk shook. We're talking about the notorious mobster, James Whitey Bulger.
Give me 3 words that describe Whitey Bulger.
Stone cold killer.
That's Southie, where he did most of his crime. He murdered people there, he buried people there, and he went to sleep there.
The gang, infamous for extorting local businesses through violence, soon targeted 21-year-old Dana with demands for money.
And one day I'm actually in there teaching a class, and these guys literally walk right into the middle of the class.
And they're like, hey, we need to talk to you. And I said, I'm teaching a class here. And they're like, we need to talk to you outside.
They start asking me if I know who they are, and I don't.
So Whitey Bulger had a guy who worked under him, and his name was Kevin Weeks. Yeah, they wanted $2,500 from me.
You know, $2,500. I was 21 years old. You might as well ask me for $25,000. Right. I didn't have $2,500.
What do you do?
I ignored him. I didn't do anything. You know, I tried to avoid him for a while, and you can only avoid that for so long. And
months went by, and one day I got a call at my apartment.
the guy's like,
"You got till tomorrow at 1 to pay us."
And I said, "Or what?"
"Are you gonna find out what?"
I said, "Okay." I hung up the phone.
Picked it back up and called Delta and got a one-way ticket to Vegas.
Back in Las Vegas, Dana concentrated on building a new life. Unexpectedly, his journey led him to a friend's wedding, where fate would soon reconnect him with Lorenzo Fertitta.
I go to his wedding, and who do I run into? The Fertitta brothers.
Wow.
Lorenzo Fertitta comes up to me and says, "Hey, how you been?" And this and that, good. You know, we hadn't seen each other since high school. So he says to me at the wedding, I hear you're doing this boxing thing. I just got on the athletic commission. I would love to come train with you. I said, let's do it on Monday. He came and trained with me on Monday, and we've been together ever since. Wow.
During these sessions, the gym began to attract several professional fighters, including many UFC athletes. Dana and Lorenzo were blown away by the incredible skill and athleticism of these fighters. However, despite the talent on display, the UFC was struggling to survive. At the time, the UFC was owned by Rory and Gracie, Art Davie and Bob Meyerowitz. The early events were notorious for their lack of rules and regulations. No weight classes, minimal oversight, and almost no safety measures. While the raw brutality initially garnered a cult following, it also drew sharp criticism from influential figures like Senator John McCain.
What it was at the beginning was human cockfighting. It was. I mean, I've seen people repeatedly getting smashed in the face with a guy sitting on top of him. That's not a sport. That's a throwback to the Roman Colosseum.
McCain launched a national campaign to ban the UFC, describing it as a barbaric spectacle. He pressured cable companies to stop broadcasting the events, which drastically cut into the UFC's revenue. Facing mounting opposition and financial struggles, Rory and Gracie and Art Davie sold their shares, leaving Bob Meyerowitz as the sole owner of the company. By this time, Dana had expanded his involvement in the fight world, becoming the manager for two rising MMA stars, Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. However, the UFC showed little interest in signing Liddell, and Ortiz was deeply dissatisfied with his UFC contract.
I was managing Chuck and Tito, and I was talking to the old owner, Bob Meyerowitz. We got in this contract battle over Tito Ortiz's contract. I was talking about pay-per-view, and he flipped out. He says, "There is no fucking pay-per-view. There's no money. This thing's, blah, blah, blah." They were going bankrupt. This thing might be for sale. I called the Fertitta brothers, and I said, "Listen, I think we can buy this thing. These guys are in trouble. They're going out of business. I think we should give it a shot."
So I called Bob, literally cold called him, and he was looking for somebody to put up $1 million for 50% of the company. I ended up calling back and just said, "Look, we'd be interested in doing the deal, but we want to buy the whole thing."
And a month later, we owned the company.
Once the Fertitta brothers purchased the UFC for $2 million, their first move was to appoint Dana White as president and give him a 10% stake in the company. What they acquired for their money, however, was little more than a brand name and a logo.
Essentially, you bought the name and a
old wooden octagon
for $2 million.
Yeah, and I think we had like 11 guys under contract. He had sold everything off. The DVD rights, all the old library, the video game rights, the merchandise rights. If there was anything worth a penny connected with those three letters UFC, he sold it. We didn't even own UFC.com. UFC.com used to be user-friendly computers.
The organization was in complete disarray. MMA events were banned on television, outlawed in most states, and blocked internationally. Pay-per-view providers refused to carry the broadcasts, leaving no platform for the UFC to reach fans. To make matters worse, many of its biggest stars like Ken Shamrock and Mark Coleman had moved on to professional wrestling or joined the UFC's biggest competitor, Pride FC.
The only two companies in this world that matter are the UFC and Pride.
Pride FC was thriving in Japan, where MMA had a strong cultural foothold. The organization was filling massive stadiums and boasting the best fighters in the world, including top American athletes. In contrast, the UFC was struggling to survive. Dana's immediate goal was to transform the UFC's image. He recognized that the public viewed it as human cockfighting and knew the sport needed legitimacy to succeed. Instead of shying away from regulation, Dana and the Fertittas made it their top priority.
So we did the exact opposite of what he did. We ran toward regulation.
The team adopted the unified rules of mixed martial arts, which introduced weight classes, standardized fight durations, and clear guidelines on legal and illegal techniques. These changes gave the UFC credibility and allowed Dana to begin the uphill battle of convincing athletic commissions to legalize the sport. Dana traveled across the United States, lobbying state officials and athletic commissions to regulate MMA. Meanwhile, the Fertitta brothers assembled a strong team to help rebuild the UFC. They appointed Lawrence Epstein as the company's chief operating officer.
My name is Lawrence Epstein, first of all, and I'm the chief operating officer of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So I'm responsible for day-to-day operations of the company.
Mark Ratner, former executive director of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, also joined the team.
It was a hard decision for me to make, but it's pretty hard to tell Lorenzo and Dana no.
The Senior Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs. Did I get that right?
That's exactly right, yes.
And what does that title mean exactly?
It means I go around to states and countries to get the sport of MMA approved.
To ensure exciting matchups, Joe Silva and Sean Shelby were brought on as official matchmakers.
If there's a fight on camera, we've probably seen it between the two of us.
For production quality, the UFC hired Bruce Connell, an experienced producer from ESPN. And to enhance the fan experience, they recruited Joe Rogan as a commentator.
I'll be interviewing the fighters as they come out of the octagon. Anything we need to know, as soon as I find out, you'll know.
Despite these efforts, the UFC was hemorrhaging money. Over the next few years, the Fertitta brothers invested $30 million into the company, but it wasn't enough to make a significant impact. The stigma surrounding MMA remained strong, and events struggled to gain mainstream traction.
Lorenzo called me one day. I was in my office and he's like, I can't keep doing this to my family and blowing all my family's money on this thing, man. Get out there and see what you could sell this thing for. So I started calling some guys and I called them back at the end of the day and I said, maybe we can get 5 or 6 million for this thing. And they were already in this thing, 30 million. We hung up the phone. The next morning he called me and said, F it.
Determined to grow the UFC's audience, they came up with a bold plan, a reality TV show called The Ultimate Fighter.
So all these guys live in a house, for those of you that don't know, they're coached by 2 big stars in the UFC, and they fight. Every time you fight and you lose, you get eliminated. But at the end of every episode, there's a live fight. And it would end with a finale. 2 guys fight in the finale, 1 guy becomes the Ultimate Fighter and gets a contract with the UFC.
The Fertittas committed $10 million to produce the show, knowing it was their last chance to save the UFC. If the show failed, the business would be over. Networks were reluctant to air it due to the UFC's controversial reputation. Finally, Spike TV, a male-focused network, agreed to broadcast it, but only after the UFC offered to cover production costs and provide the show for free. The Ultimate Fighter premiered in 2005 and was an instant success.
We threw this thing on the air and it just went crazy. The ratings were through the roof on this network that nobody had ever heard of.
However, midway through the season, Spike's president was fired, leaving the UFC's future uncertain.
So halfway through the season, the president of the company gets fired. They had made all these promises to me and everything else, all dead, nothing. So we go through this whole season, it's unbelievably successful, and we honestly didn't know if we were going to have a second season.
When the season finale aired, the UFC's future came down to 2 fights: Kenny Florian versus Diego Sanchez, and Stefan Bonner versus Forrest Griffin.
Kenny Florian fights a guy named Diego Sanchez. They go out there and fight. Diego Sanchez smokes him in like 40 seconds. Terrible. We've got 2 hours of programming to fill, and I'm like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. Then Forrest and Stefan come out, and they put on the sickest fight you have ever seen in your life.
And the numbers during the fight went just like this.
The place is going crazy.
People were stomping their feet, and it sounded like a train was going through the arena. And at the end of the fight, people were chanting, one more round, one more round.
Yeah. So it was so crazy and so overwhelming, we ended up giving both guys a UFC contract that night, which made the place even go crazier.
I knew when that fight was over, it didn't matter if we did another deal with Spike TV or didn't do another deal. We did it. We made it. We were going somewhere.
We literally got up out of our chairs, walked out into the alley, and cut the deal for season 2 with Spike TV that night.
On a napkin. Literally written on a napkin, the new deal for our new deal on Spike TV.
I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. If that first season didn't happen, I would not be sitting here right now. It's a fact.
After the explosive success of the Ultimate Fighter finale, the UFC doubled down on its partnership with Spike TV. They launched new programming like UFC Unleashed, Fight Night, and Countdown, providing fans with free access to fights, fighter stories, and event previews. The strategy was simple but highly effective. Offer free, high-quality content to hook fans and convert them into paying customers for pay-per-view events. At the same time, the UFC entered the gaming market with the launch of UFC Undisputed, a hugely successful video game that introduced the sport to a younger audience. With more content, games, and events, the UFC expanded its reach and solidified its dominance in the North American MMA scene. While the UFC thrived, its biggest competitor, Pride FC in Japan, was unraveling. Rumors began that the Yakuza, Japan's infamous mafia, had deep ties to Pride FC. Allegations surfaced that the organization was being used to launder money through fight fixing and illegal gambling. When these claims reached Japanese cable companies, the response was swift. Networks severed all ties with Pride, cutting off its primary revenue stream. Within a year, Pride FC was bankrupt. Seeing an opportunity, Dana White and the Fertitta brothers purchased Pride in 2007. The acquisition was a game changer. The UFC absorbed Pride's roster of world-class fighters and secured its vast fight library, providing a treasure trove of content for broadcast. The UFC continued its aggressive expansion strategy by airing free fights on Spike TV during the same nights that rival MMA promotions hosted pay-per-view events. Fans gravitated toward the free programming, and smaller promotions couldn't compete. As competitors folded, the UFC acquired their assets, including their fight libraries, which were used to grow the UFC's content arsenal.
Is WEC merging with the UFC?
Yes.
UFC has purchased Strikeforce. Is that true?
That is true.
We've got a library of 20,000 hours of original content. Of course, UFC programming. You mentioned Pride, WEC, WFA, and of course Strikeforce events.
Why did you go out and purchase Strikeforce?
We need more fights. We need more fights, more fights.
By 2011, the UFC reached one of its biggest milestones.
We ended up doing a huge deal with Fox.
This landmark deal allowed Fox to distribute over 20,000 hours of UFC content across its platforms, including live events. The partnership gave the UFC mainstream legitimacy, putting it on par with traditional sports like the NFL and MLB. However, success also brought scrutiny.
You ever hear of John Skipper?
No.
John Skipper ran ESPN. Hates UFC.
Hates it.
Hates it. Hates UFC.
Shortly after the Fox deal, ESPN released an investigative piece targeting the UFC's business practices, specifically focusing on fighter pay. This article sparked public backlash and was followed by an antitrust lawsuit filed by a group of fighters.
The multi-billion-dollar antitrust lawsuit it's currently facing from former UFC fighters.
We filed this case in December of 2014 on behalf of a group of mixed martial arts fighters who fought for the UFC.
The government came after us and called us a monopoly.
I do believe they have a monopoly. I don't know how anyone could think they don't.
The lawsuit claims the UFC, quote, engaged in an illegal scheme to eliminate competition.
I mean, anyone that starts to even be up and coming at all or poses any kind of a threat, they buy them out or they drive them out.
That allows it to pay fighters, quote, a fraction of what they would earn in a competitive marketplace.
We're spending, $7-8 million a year trying to defend ourselves from the government as a monopoly.
Despite the controversy, the UFC prevailed. The government dropped its case, and the lawsuit eventually faded away. With those hurdles behind them, the UFC focused on global expansion. They began hosting events in new markets and signing international fighters to build regional fan bases. Conor McGregor became a breakout star, bringing mainstream attention to the sport in Europe, while Ronda Rousey headlined the UFC's newly created female division and became a global icon. However, by this time, the Fertitta brothers were ready to step away.
The Fertittas were ready to get out, and they sat me down and said, we're going to sell this thing and we're ready to go, but nobody will take it unless you stay. And I got a little up. I took off for a little while, went up into a hotel room and didn't come out for a few days.
Wow.
Then I snapped out of it. I got my together.
And sold it for? $4.025 billion.
This sale marked the largest transaction in sports history at the time. While the Fertitta brothers moved on, Dana White stayed on as president, maintaining leadership and continuity for the UFC. Around the same time, the UFC's contract with Fox Sports was coming to an end.
Our Fox deal is up, and we're probably not going to end up doing another deal with Fox. John Skipper's never, ever going to take the UFC. So we're in a real tough place. John Skipper's cocaine dealer is gonna rat him out. What?
He says he resigned because his drug dealer tried to extort him. In the interview, Skipper says he was always careful about his cocaine use.
So he has to tell Disney, my cocaine dealer is probably gonna go public and whatever. So he has to step down from ESPN.
With Skipper out, ESPN's stance on the UFC shifted. In 2019, the UFC signed a $1.5 billion two-year deal with ESPN. The agreement required the UFC to produce 43 live events annually, with ESPN paying $750 million per year for exclusive broadcasting rights. The ESPN deal was a monumental win, but the UFC faced an unprecedented challenge in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the sports world.
COVID was the toughest thing I've ever had to navigate in the history of this company. And if you look at where we came from, that's actually saying something.
Companies start laying off big percentages of the workforce. You did not lay people off.
No.
By April, the UFC had hosted only 8 of its required 43 events, and the outlook was bleak.
Dana calls me up. He said, get me an island. I said, what? He said, get me an island.
Fight Island. Now, is that a clever name? No. Is it the perfect name? Yes.
That allowed you to keep your sport on the air when everything else was shut down.
Right.
So how many events did you do while the country was shut down?
We're supposed to do 43. That year we did 42. We gained a lot of fans because there was nothing to gamble on. So sports bettors started betting on UFC. When other people weren't playing, our fan base grew 46%.
Wow.
When we went through COVID.
We've been doing the impossible since 2001.
Nothing is impossible. Never tell me no. Never say we can't. If you're in business with me, don't tell me no.
If you had one thing that you learned throughout your journey in building the UFC that you could pass along to the next generation so that they could accomplish their dreams in everyday life, what would that be?
There's a lot of... I tell young people now all the time, I definitely tell my kids, if you are even fucking remotely a savage, you'll run these people over. You just gotta grind.
Yeah.
There's never been more opportunity than there is right now. If you're a fucking savage and you get out there and you grind hard and you want it bad enough, you can run all these guys over, man.